Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Charles Rutledge. I'm the Executive Director of the Sunrise County Economic Council. Most of you know me, I think, from the registration, but for the few who don't, I grew up in Harrington, went to Narragansett, um, went away to school, worked in community development for several years, and then became a lawyer. Worked in general practice in central Maine for a few years, and then in 2009 came back home and worked as the Pine Tree legal attorney for Washington County and then Washington Hancock County for several years, about 5 years. And then I've been with Sunrise County for almost 11 years now as the executive director. But today's session is trying to make sense of the role of the federal government in Washington County's economy. Um, this this has been a complicated presentation to put together. I would ask for your patience as I go through it. I would also ask if you see something where I'm making a mistake or I'm missing something or a number doesn't match with your subject matter expertise, particularly around education and healthcare, where I really have some doubts about my numbers. I would appreciate, a conversation afterwards, an email. I think this is ongoing work, and I'm looking to improve the presentation as time goes on. Um, the reason, the timing of this presentation is definitely a reaction to the potential for significant shifts in federal policy, particularly fiscal policy, that might impact taxes and spending that impact the Washington County economy. And even though there's a great deal of uncertainty about that and how it will play out, and I'm not really in a position to speak to it much at all, I did think it would be helpful to understand at least what had happened in Washington County over the past few years when it comes to federal spending, because I had a sense we were in a period of substantial change, and definitely as I dug into the numbers, that played out. But without further ado, I will move on. The first few slides are more about just context setting, about the Washington County economy as a whole, just to get a sense of context for the spending amounts we're going to be talking about later. So this is a slide I've used before. It is a way of looking at the Washington County economy on the basis of personal income. These are numbers that are compiled on an annual basis by the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, and I used an inflation adjuster essentially to bring it to constant inflation adjusted 2024 dollars for this time period. This is a long time frame. It looks from the 1969 to, I think it actually goes to 2023. In this particular slide, some of the others only go to 2022. And you can essentially get the size of the economy. Washington County has been around a $1.4 billion economy when you use personal income. We've had some years where, of course, it shot up to almost 1.8. Most of that is based on changes in government spending, as you will see. The personal income, when you adjust for inflation related to wages and self-employment and investment, tends to be surprisingly constant. Although I guess it's not that surprising, given that we've had relatively stable population over these years. But anyhow, about a 1.4 to 1.8 billion dollar economy. If you look at the economy in different measures, like using gross domestic product estimates, they come in a little bit lower because so much of the medical payments tend to be spent outside of the county. So you get closer to 1.2 billion in those numbers, but just to give a sense of scale. The next few slides just look at the value of different parts of the Washington County, again, for scale. This is the lobster landing. So this isn't the total economic activity related to lobster in the county, just the value of the actual lobster as they're landed at the dock. In recent years have hovered around 100 million with really remarkable volatility. This does include the numbers that were just released, where the Washington County catch was worth just a little under 100 million for 2024. This is the blueberry harvest farm gate value, again in inflation adjusted dollars, much smaller industry in some ways, although very volatile. in really valuable years tends to be towards 100 million. More recent years has been much lower than that. But of course, this doesn't capture the value from processing and value add and some of the other activities that are related to the industry. This takes a broader view of the economy. Again, probably somewhere around a $1.2 billion economy if you just look at gross domestic product. The taxable annual retail sales in the county. And this is based on not, this excludes online sales. So these are actually sales that physically occur in the county based on the location of the retailer. Around 350 million during this time period. So the next few slides have a lot going on in them, and I apologize for that. But they're an attempt to look at industries in Washington County with a hope of looking at which industries might be most impacted by changes in federal spending. I have a much harder time quantifying how tax policy changes impact industry, but federal spending, there's a pretty direct through line. The three categories that you see at the bottom, the dark red, the bright red, and the yellow, that's healthcare and social assistance is the dark red, educational services, which is a K through 12 system as well as higher ed, employment, um, is the bright red, and then public administration is the mustardy yellow. So when you look at um, the essentially the total, wages, the total earnings around salary and wages run about 500 million a year in Washington County. There's probably about another 100 million in self-employment earnings that aren't captured here. This is just really people who are employees. Um, and it's divided by industrial sector. I use the two-digit level of the North American Industrial Classification System for reference. Um, Healthcare and social assistance is the largest category. Educational services is a major category in public administration. Somewhere around a third of total earnings, closer to 40% of salary and wage earnings in the county are related to those three sectors. So it's just, they're very critical. And there's a lot of other tax dollars there other than just federal, but federal tax dollars play a key role. This looks at employment using the same data source from the Maine Department of Labor, the same level of specificity in kind of industrial classification. And again, you see, somewhere around 10,000 employees in Washington County, out of a civilian labor force that, was closer to 15,000, but around 10,000 employees, with 40% in those three sectors that are really critically impacted by federal policy. I guess every sector is impacted by federal policy, but those three sectors are particularly impacted by federal spending policy. This is an older graph. It's just a product that I haven't actually found an updated version of through the American Community Survey. This uses a household survey uh, as part of the American Community Survey over a 5-year moving average. Um, so it's dated. Its real advantage is it captures self-employment as well as wage and salary employment. And you can see a similar pattern of, this group's educational services and healthcare and social assistance together, but as the largest single sector. This, of course, captures fishermen in a way that the previous data did not. So, ag, forestry, and fishing is another major sector. Retail trade is important, as you would expect. I think construction is, you can also see a greater number here than you saw in the other category because of the importance of sole proprietors or, people who work for themselves in the industry. Um, but anyhow, again, that basic, we're a natural resource dependent economy, but the largest single sector is around education and healthcare. So going back to personal income with a different kind of lens at this point, um, this I'd like to pay attention to the components of personal income, particularly how they have changed in recent years. This looks at the same data source, but just looking at the 2019 to 2023 to show in a little bit more clarity of what's happened. Again, relatively stable wages and self-employment and investment income once you account for inflation, but quite a bit of variation, you know, 200 million plus or 200 million or so in personal income associated with transfer payments. And in Washington County, transfer payments are almost entirely from the public sector. This looks at those personal income from government transfers again over that very long time frame with adjusted for inflation. Um, and this kind of breaks out for scale, which I think is useful. One is retirement and disability insurance benefits, the blue at the bottom, that's Social Security. Medical benefits is where most of the growth is and most of the spending. And that includes Medicare and Medicaid in this particular data source. And these are payments on behalf of individuals based on the residence of the individual, not payments that actually occur in the county necessarily. Income maintenance benefits is that navy line that tends to be what we think of as welfare generally, food stamps, temporary aid to needy families, supplemental security income, so Social Security that's not based on a wage record, that group of benefits. Unemployment compensation is that light purple above it. Veterans benefits, the dark purple above that. Education and training assistance, this is just to individuals. This is essentially Pell Grants. So it's, if you included all the aid to public schools, particularly K through 12 schools, it would be a much larger number. And other includes refundable tax credits. And that is a bit more apparent on the next slide, which looks at a much shorter time frame. That's one of those areas where we've seen some dramatic shifts in federal policy on a year-to-year basis on tax credits. And where actually one of the major forms of federal spending, if one considers it spending, that's been occurring in Washington County, particularly since the pandemic and in the response to the pandemic, because that was one of the primary strategies that the federal government employed. This is a longer time frame looking at refundable tax credits, something that had a negligible effect, until really the 90s. And then relatively steady, at under 10 million a year in valuation, inflation adjusted dollars until we get to the Great Recession and the government responds to it. And then has become a more important tool of the federal government in, in enacting policy, including, really at its peak in the response to the pandemic, where the value exceeded $100 million. So there's a year there where the value of refundable tax credits rivaled the value of lobster landings in the county, just as context. This looks at a particular type of refundable tax credits, the economic impact payments or stimulus payments that were enacted in response to the pandemic in 3 rounds. And these are all inflation adjusted. Even though this is a short time frame, we went through such a period of high inflation in the aftermath of or during, I guess it's all during the pandemic, but after the first economic shock of the pandemic, when there was the economic recovery began afterwards, we went through a period of pretty intense inflation. So it actually makes a difference, significant difference, actually, even looking back 2020 and 2021. So this is inflation adjusted to 2024 dollars. The first round, a little under 30 million to Washington County residents, then 15 in round 2 in the same year. And then round 3 exceeded 40 million. So really large, injections of cash and of federal spending, a form of federal spending into the county. This looks at a different policy, the earned income tax credit that were claimed by Washington County residents, again, inflation adjusted. Not such a significant impact with the pandemic, but still a significant form of expenditures. Definitely something I'm keeping my eye on, as with so many tax debates happening in DC over the coming months. Um, expenditures that, you know, right now is about half the value of food stamps, many times the value of TANF in the county. Um, so a significant amount for low-income households. Um, Most recently running, a little over 7 million or about 7 million. Uh, this, you should notice a difference in scale. This is the value of both TANF, so temporary aid for needy families, and parents as scholars benefits issued to Washington County residents these are actually in January 2025 dollars. So essentially current dollars. Um, the top number here is 1.4 million. And this is on an annual basis. The 1.2 is kind of the highest it's gotten, on that scale, compared to, medical spending where we're talking in the hundreds of millions, very important for the households that are affected, um, and impacted directly, but a relatively modest amount of spending in the county. And I should say this is almost all TANF. The caseload for parents as scholars during this period range from between 0 to 4. So, a small percentage of these benefits are directly related to parents as scholars as a program. This looks at SNAP benefits. Again, very different um, values on the access, around 25 million is, the highest per year. Even in recent years, when some of the eligibility criteria have shifted a bit, and the amount of benefits, which is probably the more important change per recipient, has changed. The amount has kind of settled back to about 15 million a year in value when you account for inflation. And the number of participants did not change that much during the pandemic. I thought that it would because of shifts in eligibility and all, but it was mostly a change in the value of benefits issued, um, per household or per qualifying household, rather than a shift in the number of households that qualified. And I should mention that these are benefits that are issued, not necessarily spent in this particular time period. It's just the amount that was issued to uh, Washington County households. So this tries to unpack, not just the economic impact, the gross amount of dollars being spent from some of these safety net programs, but how many people are covered. And in particular, this looks at 2023, which is the most recent year that full data has been reported, um, for temporary aid for needy families or supplemental nutrition assistance program coverage, um, for children in Washington County. So about a third of Washington County children live in a home that is receiving food stamps or TANF benefits. Just a really, I think, relevant if those programs would see a significant shift in support, it would disproportionately impact children, as one would expect. And I should say food stamps is what really will make a difference for the most number of children, not necessarily TANF. Only about 4% of children in Washington County are in households that are current that are were receiving TANF. And this is an average monthly, the caseload is reported on a monthly basis. So this is an average across the months in 2023. Taking that average and then, of course, using the estimate of the number of children based on the American Community Survey. So the numbers are a little apples and oranges, but the scale or perspective or scale is, I think, still useful. About in this estimate, about 4% of children in Washington County were in households that received temporary aid for needy families in 2023 on average during the year. Now, this looks at SNAP benefits, not just children. This is all individuals in Washington County that are in households that were issued SNAP benefits. This again uses a monthly figure, looking from January 20, so just before the pandemic, um, to January 2025, which is the most recent numbers that DHHS has reported. The numbers varied some, you know, between 6,200 at a low, high around 7,000. Um, and of course, during most of this period, there were between 31 and 32,000 people living in Washington County year round, or with Washington County as their residents. So you get a sense of how many people are in households where food stamps is part of, you know, the what makes the household run. So the next few slides try to unpack medical spending. This is where the money is from the federal spending standpoint. Um, it is over 300 million in value in recent years. Again, these are payments on behalf of Washington County residents. I don't have exact numbers, but my sense is that the vast majority of these dollars are spent outside of Washington County for or spent for things like pharmaceuticals, where most of the value is going to intellectual property and manufacturing that occurs outside the county, or for specialist care, or even just general care that occurs actually outside of Washington County. Um, but it's definitely where federal spending has increased the most and is just the largest number. If you take a single, um, a single source of spending, and we will make the slides available. We'll send out a deck and a PDF form for all the attendees. And our plan is to put the recording of the webinar on our website as well, but that may take a little while till that's edited and up. This looks at the same data source. Again, this is personal income data from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis for a tighter time frame, 2019 to 2022. Unfortunately, the Bureau of Economic Analysis discontinued this particular data set in 2022. So that's where the numbers end. But you can see here that Medicare benefits, so essentially the federal program that pays for healthcare for the elderly and the permanently disabled, has been relatively consistent, somewhere around 125 million a year. Um, and that public assistance medical care benefits, which is essentially Maine care, is making up that large gap of 175,000 or so, sorry, 175 million or so between the Maine care benefits and the total amount. TRICARE is a teeny portion here. This is not capturing veterans benefits, healthcare. Just so that's a separate, just it's a gap in the data set that's not included here. It does come in some of the U.S. Treasury data that will be later on in the presentation. This is an imperfect data set because it doesn't capture Medicare Advantage. But at least gets a sense of something being directly reported by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, adjusted for inflation with information from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Running, up until about 2019, running a little over 80 million a year, declining in recent years, largely, I believe, as a switch to Medicare Advantage plans, from what I can tell from the data. But again, confirmation that those numbers from you know, you know, the numbers from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, it corresponds to that. So this looks at Maine care coverage, including buy-in, and I was actually a little shocked at these numbers. It's a little over 13,000 people in Washington County. Varies from time period to time period. This is using an average of the monthly enrollment. It does include buy-in, which is when people who are income qualified, Maine Care will pay for certain premiums and deductibles related to Medicare. So there's a decent amount of overlap here between Medicaid and Medicare. But it definitely infers that at least half of the people in Washington County are relying on Medicaid or Medicare for their health care coverage. So beyond the economic impact of payments to providers in Washington County and the job impacts it may have on health and human services kind of sector, um, it definitely is part of, again, how a significant proportion of the population of Washington County has health insurance. This is another way of looking at that same data source, um, just on the monthly level, where you can see between 13 and 14,000, depending on the uh, month, um, were covered by Maine Care, but that includes the buy-in. So it includes significant overlap with those covered by Medicare. Okay, and I think this is a Medicare benefit. So this is reported from the, so again, you can't add this number to the other number and get, 23, 24,000. There's a great deal of overlap between these two numbers. But this shows an increasing number of people, now a little bit over 10,000, that are receiving Medicare or Medicare beneficiaries who reside in Washington County. And this is, sorry, a duplicate slide, but you can see again that same payments on fee for service parts A and B for Washington County residents. So the next few slides actually look at the outgoing portion of federal policy and tax. This looks at tax liability for Washington County residents. Um, you know, in most years around 80 million a year. So significantly less than the types of expenditures we've been talking about. Even when the next slide will show the contributions to Social Security. So the IRS reports, tax liability in different ways. This is a particular way of measuring it. I believe this is before income tax credits are essentially applied to the tax liability. This looks at um, essentially contributions to the portion of Social Security, so old age survivors and disability insurance portion of Social Security that relies on a wage record. So these are essentially the Social Security payroll taxes that were paid in Washington County between 2018 and 2022, around 60 million a year once you account for inflation, with a majority being from wage and salary, but still a significant portion being related to self-employed individuals. And I will mention just this is under half of the distribution of benefits from this portion of Social Security. So that is probably due to the fact that we have many people who move to Washington County, who may spend a portion of their working years outside of Washington County, um, and then move back to Washington County or move here for the first time as they enter into collecting Social Security benefits. But we are definitely a county where there are significantly more expenditures from Social Security than payroll taxes being paid into the system. So this slide and the several that follow it try to unpack federal spending in Washington County from a different data source. Um, this is from the U.S. Department of the Treasury, particularly the usspending.gov tool. It is a really incredibly detailed tool that allows a person to focus on to individual contracts issued between the federal government and other entities. Um, it is not meant to do what I'm trying to do with it, which is trying to look at a regional impact of federal spending. And it's a little clunky for that. But there's an incredible amount of detail there if anyone would want to check that out. And that was just usaspending.gov. Um, and this does not include some expenditures to the state of Maine that then are federal funds that then are spent on program. It does not include spending directly on federal staff members. Um, these are really payments to third parties. And the type of contract that is depicted in, or payments that are depicted in this graph includes both direct payments to individuals. So that's where the Social Security, the Department of Veterans Affairs would come in, um, as well as contracts with prime contractors, not subprime or subcontractors, sorry. Subcontracts would be a separate search and a separate numbers, which can't be added to prime because it's very possible they will be a prime who contracts within the same county for the work. So you'd have duplicate numbers if you included these subcontracts as well. So this is an incomplete set of federal expenditures, but it's still, I think, useful to get a sense of what the scale has been and really how much it shifted year to year from some major federal departments. As you can see here, the largest expenditure, in many years, getting close to 200 million a year, is payments from the Social Security Administration to individuals. And I would say when it comes to federal policy and kind of a federal program, it is hard to overstate the importance of Social Security to the Washington County economy. It is a major source, both in tax policy of 60 plus million a year going out of the county to fund the program, and somewhere towards 200 million a year coming into the county in benefits to residents. Um, it's just incredibly significant. I would also point out a few others, which I'll get to in, there's a bunch of slides after this that look at individual federal departments. I would mention we have had a period of really large shifts in policy, which you can see with the Department of Commerce, which is this bright yellow, normally a pretty minor direct contractor in Washington County. And then you're starting to see the impact, I think, largely of the river restoration projects on the St. Croix, where there have been some pretty large grants awarded and obligated. Oh, and I should mention this particular search looked at contracts as they were obligated, not as outlays or expenditures occurred. So the full value of the contract is listed in the year that it's awarded, essentially, and the contract is underwritten, even though most of these contracts, not the direct payments to individuals, but most of the contracts are expense reimbursement. So the federal government will only essentially pay for fishway construction as the fishway is built. So that those expenditures may be spaced out over several years. In this particular data source, the contracts are underwritten in the federal fiscal year 2024, and that's a October 2023 to September 2024 fiscal year. That's that period where you start to see 30 plus million in obligations for Department of Commerce through the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. Another thing I will mention here is I do think the Department of Education expenditures, and I did try to get to that from another source that will be later in the presentation. I do think that's undercounted here. Again, because of this look at direct contracts between the federal government and school districts, as opposed to money that would flow through the state of Maine. So these same data source, usaspending.gov, looking at direct payments and prime contract obligations based on place of performance. Should mention you also can do a search by the place or the primary place of business of the contractor. But in this case, this is based on place of performance. That looking at just how significant Social Security is. Now, this looks at Department of Veterans Affairs, both direct payments to individuals for direct benefits, as well as prime contract obligations. A pretty significant, always over 30 million during this time frame. Some years significantly higher. I think largely dependent on probably some larger contracts that were obligated, but a major contributor to the Washington County economy. Another area when looking at shifts in public policy and where public policy might have an impact, where particularly around veterans benefits or veterans health care could have a significant impact on the Washington County economy. This isn't one I didn't expect, but Department of Defense. And it's, I guess, the case of where the money is. It's, one of the largest departments in the federal government. Um, and even when you look at the prime contract lens for place of performance, is a not insignificant amount of contracting in Washington County. Some of this, I think, is related to the operations of the Cutler base. And I don't have a breakdown between that and unrelated defense spending, but is probably part of kind of the underlying numbers here. A Department of the Interior is another major, varying in year to year, depending on which contracts were obligated when. Most of these are related to contracts with the Passamaquoddy tribal governments. That's Abayak and Indian Township. Um, it does probably include some amount of contracting related to the wildlife refuges with Petite Manan and Moosehorn. But though I would expect, just from looking at kind of other data sources, that most of this is between the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the tribal governments. This is at U.S. Department of Transportation. I mean, there's been a lot of road work and a lot of contracts um, underwritten in recent years. I think, if anything, this is an undercount of the spending in the county. So, in general, over 20 million a year in contracts being obligated and quite a lot of outlays as well. And a decent amount that's still in the pipeline. So I'm not sure how quickly changes in federal policy will have an impact on the level of road construction. And some other big projects, like the Safe Harbor project in Lubec, which is actually larger. It's like 3 times larger in some ways than the annual outlays um, that are depicted here. So there are some really large projects that rely on federal dollars that are in the pipeline for next year. It looks at Department of Ag, direct payments and prime contract obligations in the county. Um, that surge of spending with the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, right in FY 2023, coming down a little. It's very possible that that level may return more to that historic around 10 million, 12 million a year level that we had seen, pre-pandemic. And this looks at Department of Education again directly. Um, this is this is an imperfect data set, just the way, it is undercounting by a significant measure the expenditures. Um, but again, there's these prime contracts that vary between a little under 3 million to a little over 6 million. If you look at the Maine Department of Education reporting, which is the next slide, you can see an estimate of a little over 10 million for expenditures. This data set does exclude WA, or so Washington Academy. So it is an imperfect data set. Um, it's essentially the reporting that the state does related to the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the act that replaced the No Student Left Behind kind of funding structure. Um, but at least it gives a sense of the total scale of funding for the K through 12 public school system, somewhere north of 70 million a year, with over 10 million of that coming from the federal government. I think this is an undercount from what I've read of other analysis that, tend to talk of, a few percentages more in rural areas being, dependent on federal government, but is a significant source of funds for rural schools. Now, I have kind of blazed through my presentation, but would be happy to take any questions at this point. And I do recognize this is a lot of information to unpack in a relatively short period of time. Um, but Thea, if you wouldn't mind kind of changing the settings.
I did.
Oh, good. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, you'd like me to go over something again that I may have gone over too quickly, please raise your hand and we'll hopefully have a conversation.
See, yeah, the presentation is still up.
Okay. Oh, and I should say before I take this off, this is my email. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to email me directly or call the office here.
So, Charles, this is Sarah Strickland. Um, of all of this data and all these, this is so valuable to kind of see the size and scope of Washington County. Which are the which are the pieces of this puzzle that wake you up in the middle of the night and or when you wake up in the morning, you're paying the closest attention to as things unfold in Washington?
So I think I mean, obviously, as I've said, I actually think Social Security is one of the most important federal functions in the county. Um, to my knowledge, there actually aren't proposals for significant changes to Social Security being proffered by any kind of major political group in DC right now. So it's not something I spend a lot of time worrying about, but would definitely pay a great deal of attention if a proposal that would shift how benefits or taxes work with Social Security came up. Beyond that, um, very interested in tax credit policy. Um, I think that tax credits have a big impact on family well-being. You know, they're a major form of federal spending that often, runs under the radar a bit. Um, and, act as direct cash transfers between the federal government and the individual, either through reduced tax liability or through a refundable tax credit that may be independent of tax liability. And I think they're an area where there's probably going to be significant changes. There have been significant changes from a year-on-year basis. I didn't have a slide here just because the definition changes every year or almost every year, as well as the refundability. But there were years in the pandemic where the refundable tax credit was over $10 million in Washington County. I mean, that's not inflation adjusted, so it might be more like 12 million in inflation adjusted dollars. So a really significant payment, and even now, tax credits that are non-refundable but can be used against tax liability are over 5 million a year in value in Washington County. So tax credit policy has been an area of constant innovation and change over the last decade or so. And I definitely am really curious what happens next and think it will be very impactful to Washington County. Um, so that's a kind of Social Security is probably the most important single area. Tax credit policy, I think, could be extremely impactful and is almost certain to change. It's changed regularly throughout the last decade. I expect it to change significantly during the reconciliation process, however, the budget is finalized for this year. In other categories, um, transportation spending, of course, that's a slower burn, but incredibly important. Education spending, overall, mostly because of how it might shift property tax burdens or other expenditures. And I'd have to say another category, which probably should have been just after Social Security, is Medicare and Medicaid spending. Medicare spending is really significant, although to at least my understanding of the current policy debates in DC is not really on the table for significant changes, but it is just where a lot of money is, like Social Security. So it is an important thing to watch. Um, Medicaid, and of course, Maine Care, the state system that's funded in part through Medicaid, is um, is very much up for debate. How that program will be structured and its level of funding, at least in the reconciliation debate, and that would have a significant impact in a few ways. One is just how many people in Washington County rely on it. either to provide full health insurance or to provide a portion of the cost of their health insurance. So it just impacts well over a third, 40%, maybe of the population, depending on which month you're looking at. So just a significant impact in the county. Um, there also is the state budgetary impact. If there's a major shift in the state and federal partnership on who pays for what in Maine Care and Medicaid, that could provide or could create a great deal of budget stress at the state level, which would impact state spending just because there's so much money involved. Um, and it could have an impact on workforce in Washington County. That one is a little harder to unpack, but it is a major source of revenue for healthcare providers in the county. Even though the majority of the funds being spent for Washington County residents, I believe, are being spent outside the county, even that portion that's being spent in the county is a major revenue source for those providers. And, the job impacts of a significant shift in funding, particularly around Medicaid, Maine Care, I think could be noticeable in the local economy. I would also wish I understood tariffs a lot better and how they impact Washington County economy, but that's something I've only barely begun to dig into. But I think that could be impactful as well. And in ways that maybe are not particularly easy to ascertain in the beginning because we're partners and neighbors with Canada, but we're also competitors in several key industries. And I'm not sure actually how tariffs would impact the economy in Washington County over the long term if they were instituted.
I think what you're doing is very important, bringing real information to us. Um, and while it's a foreign language to me. It's not economics, and this is not something that is natural. I kind of got the gist of it. And I think that it would be exceedingly valuable if this were done on a regular basis over the next year, throughout this next transition. Um, and and as just as for me, I have a little suggestion. I would have liked to have had a running total, federal income coming in, and every time you hit a slide, it would go up or down, and federal expense, so that it would have focused it easier on me. Um, and so, in my question to you is. Could you give me a running ballpark figure? The federal government spends X amount of some hypothetical amount of money, um, and we, yes, that's it, I think.
Hey, that is hard to do. Um, it so I think it's definitely safe to say that the federal government spends a larger amount in Washington County, or at least on behalf of Washington County residents, than Washington County residents pay into the federal government in federal income taxes and Social Security and payroll taxes. I think that is pretty clear, even given missing data sources and double counting and all the flaws that are in this presentation, honestly, and this way of trying to look at federal expenditures on a program by program basis using department level reports that were not intended to talk about economic impact. They were intended to talk, just to be transparent about public sector expenses and outcomes of the particular programs. Having said that, I do think that um, on a personal income basis, it is somewhere, you know, maybe around a third of the economy is related to federal and state spending. I think if you would look at the employment numbers, somewhere, like as I said before, somewhere around 40% or so of employees in Washington County are in sectors that are heavily impacted, are entirely dependent on state and federal spending, and are heavily impacted by the federal part of that component. Um, for an actual running total, um, the federal um, the federal direct payments and prime contract obligations that were somewhere like in FY 2024 were a little over 400 million is not a bad starting point. It underestimates the impact though, because it doesn't include those direct expenditures for um, federal employees in the county. Not that we have a huge number in the county, but those that we do, it does not count those, including in border enforcement, where you do start getting some real significant payroll around a customs and border patrol. Um, and it doesn't fully account for the expenditures that flow through the state of Maine before they are come into Washington County. So it's somewhere probably significantly north of 400 million a year. Um, is my kind of best guess from looking at these different numbers. And that again is an economy that, depending how you measure it, it's around 1.2 billion. So again, around a third, maybe moving towards like 40% of the economy. But that includes state as well as federal. Actually, it doesn't. That this would include just federal. There are additional impacts on state expenditures, which might have a slightly larger one. Marcia,
Um, Charles, going back to the conversation about Maine Care, I'm wondering if you have any information either by number of individuals or by amount of dollars into the county prior to the Maine Care expansion in 2019? And just thinking about changes that may be coming in policy around that.
I don't, although there are good data sources at a state level that have been published by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So there is, there definitely are resources there. I have not found, although I could be missing it, but I have not found a good resource at the county level for those shifts in coverage. Um, and that might be possible through a Freedom of Information Act request to get a longer time period from the Department of Health and Human Services. But for what's publicly available on their website, you don't get much of the pre-expansion.
Okay, that's what I had seen too. So thank you.
It is significant though. I don't know the exact difference, but from at least on a state level, and it's not something I spent a lot of time reading, but I did notice when I was looking, trying to get to state or to county level Medicaid expenditures, which, as you will notice, is something that was not in this presentation. I have not found a data source that I have been able to use readily that would give me those numbers. And it's something I didn't mention, but I probably will in this context. Um, I can pull up the slide or the congressionally directed spending has actually been a significant source of federal funding in recent years. Um, and I just am going to open quickly. I apologize if I'm a little distracted. Yeah, there was about I'm just looking at the FY24, but about 59 million in congressionally directed spending requests that were included in the FY24 federal budget that are based on expenditures in Washington County or have significant impact on Washington County. And I think the number from FY23 was not that different. That has been a major source of funding just in recent years. I don't actually know what the prospects are for congressionally directed spending in the FY25 budget or in future years. But that is an area, again, in all these areas where we've seen significant shifts year to year and kind of changes in orders of magnitude in some departments, federal department spending in Washington County. The congressionally directed spending definitely is part of that mix as well.
There's a couple questions in the chat.
Okay. For Marcia, yes. As far as I know, most of the data sources that include Washington County kind of use a geographic definition that would include both Passamaquoddy reservations. And Jessica, I agree. I don't, it probably would be possible to unpack some of the state spending. Definitely looking at K through 12 public education, the state share of transportation spending. Yeah, I don't have those numbers, but it's obviously quite significant. And something that is, in my opinion, in the mix in this situation to the extent changes in federal policy create different budget realities at the state of Maine, which easily could shift how the legislature and the governor prioritize spending across programs. And that would have, of course, have an impact on Washington County.
Charles, I really appreciated how you disaggregated some of the supplemental nutrition assistance program data, the SNAP data, to consider how many children are in SNAP participating households and how changes in policy there might really disproportionately affect kids in Washington County. And I just wondered if there were other, whether specific to SNAP, like were there other populations you were concerned about there, or other I'll ask you to respond to potential fiscal policy changes, although I'm super tempted to ask you to also respond to social policy changes. But are there other fiscal policy changes that have you worried about specific populations in Washington County? Like you really drilled down with SNAP and you're like, this affects a lot of kids. Are there other vulnerable populations that rise to the surface for you as you look across these federal supports to Washington County?
Yes. I mean, children particularly. I mean, you know as well as I do that children are much more, households with children are more likely to be poor, more likely to be in poverty than households without children. And it is much higher for households with children under 5. It's a major risk factor to have a young child in the household when you look at the economic well-being of the household. And it's largely because of gaps in childcare and in other supports that might allow the adults in the household to have earnings. So of course, households with children under 5, households with children are the more vulnerable households in the county. And I'm, concerned about them, particularly, I think around food stamps when I think of a program that, 15 million a year is significant in Washington County, but, it's not like medical spending or something that's driving thousands of jobs or at least hundreds of jobs, but still really impactful for those households. And I would say, even though it is not part of the current policy debate, it's really hard to overemphasize the importance of Social Security and Medicare for families with, households with individuals over 65. It's just, I think we would be facing a fundamentally different economy and fundamentally different social reality if those kind of critical social insurance supports changed in a fundamental way. That isn't part of the current policy debate, so it's not something I wake up in the night worrying about. Um, but if it would become part of the current policy debate in a future period, that would just reshape, well, probably every economy, particularly every rural economy, but definitely would reshape Washington County. 200 million a year in direct kind of income to households in the county. It's just hard to overestimate how important that is to making, both for people's well-being in those households, but also just for making the economy as a whole run in the county. And I am also keeping an eye on the Department of Interior spending. Tribal government are major employers. They're major providers, you know, sometimes in partnership with other entities, but major providers of both education and healthcare and other critical services. Um, and that, is largely funded by federal spending, and contracts between tribal government and federal departments. So if there was a significant shift in the amount or priorities or changes in how federal spending worked there, it would really impact tribal government, which are two major employers that provide a set of critical services. Oh, I do see the question about being afraid of data disappearing. Um, I really, I mean, we saw, the Bureau of Economic Analysis ceasing publication of the key data set that allows you to unpack um, government transfers, public sector transfers and the public safety net kind of components of personal income, which was done, basically on a budget cost decision about a year ago, I think, from what I can tell. So I'm always concerned about data ending, particularly these long time series that allow you to use the same category with the same definition over a 5 year or 10 year or 20-year period. Just once the government stops publishing data on that particular way, you lose the time series. It's one of the reasons why it was so hard to try to come up with a decent slide to talk about child tax credits, because there's been so many shifts in policy in that area. It's very hard to do a time series. So I am very much concerned about government data and how any changes to how it's reported or emphasized just would make it very hard to look back over time periods. So, Paul, that's something that I think is a real concern is in a if we are moving into a period, I mean, we've always been in a period of scarcity when it comes to the amount of dollars available in Maine Care to reimburse providers. If we're heading into a period of increased scarcity, um, whether the reimbursement rates will allow for viable business models for nonprofits and institutions like our hospitals and our federally qualified health centers is really concerning. Where we might, with the worst case scenario is you have a benefit, but a benefit where there are no providers because the reimbursement rates don't allow for a viable business model. And I do think you know, that is where there could be, really negative outcomes depending on decisions made kind of at the federal and the state level on how to accommodate any significant changes in funding, which is kind of a different policy debate than the number of beneficiaries or the covered populations, which I think is kind of a set of policy debates, also debates over what is covered, what services will be reimbursed, and then the debate around the reimbursement level, and whether it's at a point where there's a viable business model to actually provide those services in a rural area.
Charles, can you speak to just it's kind of recent, but what we should be watching for with some of the changes at NOAA?
So that I don't know, honestly, based on news reports. When I thought of changes of NOAA that I was paying attention to was largely around the federal investment in fish passage, which has been most of the expenditures that actually had a direct, you know, federal contracts that directly related to jobs being created in the construction industries or in other industries in Washington County. And there's a lot of money in the pipeline that hasn't been spent, tens of millions of dollars of awarded grants that have not been spent. And I'm definitely keeping an eye on a shift in federal policy that would mean that those dollars wouldn't be spent, or those would be the last dollars of federal dollars that would be spent on fish passage in Washington County. If there are major shifts in how the government provides weather forecasts or, does fisheries regulation, that I can't unpack at this point, but is definitely something we're paying attention to, particularly around fisheries regulation. Um, just like it's hard to overstate the importance of social security, it's really hard to overstate the importance of the lobster fishery in Washington County. It is thousands of jobs between direct and indirect impacts. In jobs that it's just hard to see what replaces them in the communities where they are if something would happen to the lobster fishery. So that, the question of regulation of the fishery, the risk around changes in gear, changes in which areas are open to fishing, when they're open to fishing, all of which is possible at the federal level, is a major concern. And honestly, NOAA's ability to engage in that conversation and make decisions in a timely way and be responsive is, of course, a concern. But I don't have direct insight into what's happening at NOAA or know if any of the changes have had a direct impact on things that will impact the lobster fishery at this point, or the weather service or other things where there's critical services for the county.
Thank you.
Another question in the chat.
Yeah. So I think my sense is changes to the safety net and how they might impact families' ability to find a place to live, pay for heating, pay for food, maintain transportation, find childcare, those areas. And, I think there is an infrastructure to some degree of nonprofits and volunteer efforts, some very grassroots, that are a way to get involved and a way to help families that are struggling with those basic needs who may be impacted by shifts in federal spending and how it impacts the safety net. I don't know, honestly, when it comes if there's going to be major shifts in employment. So major shifts in employment in the nonprofit sector or in other sectors that are really intertwined with federal government spending. Um, and that I think very much comes into, you know, probably interpersonal relationships and knowing people who may be impacted and, um, you know, and just as a community as people find different ways to make a living if their current way of making a living isn't viable anymore. But that's, I feel, getting a little bit ahead of what we know, since so much of that will be impacted by decisions that Congress will make on the FY25 and subsequent federal budgets. Barbara, I'm sorry, I think you might be muted.
There. I think what I was trying to ask was, is there any countywide groupings that are looking for proactive ways to deal with this chaotic situation that we don't know what's going to be happening. But is there a county-wide um, look at this? Yes.
So I would guess I have to start by saying, Sunrise County Economic Council by design is nonpartisan. It's our duty to try to bring in federal resources, state resources, help develop the Washington County economy with whoever's elected. And so we
Yeah.
do, and we rarely get involved at the policy level when policy is being formulated. We're usually involved after a law is passed, after regulations are issued, to try to figure out how to bring in resources to Washington County or how to help the Washington County economy when, kind of once those questions are settled. I do know there are groups of active volunteers in the county who are taking, you know, both, are advocating for different outcomes in the public policy space. And I definitely think there's space there. I don't know what they are directly, but I'm sure there's spaces to volunteer. Um, I'm not sure of a single clearinghouse. I don't know, Charlie, if, I know the Connection Initiative is really focused primarily on professionals who are working, in the nonprofit sector to connect and network. But if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about kind of the opportunities for, community members to participate in that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Charles. And great question, Barbara. Um, so the Community Caring Collaborative, um, for folks who aren't familiar with the organization, is a partnership of nonprofits and tribal organizations, state agency partners that's been working in Washington County since 2007 to really support collaboration that helps people here be healthy and hopeful and well. And we are looking at, together with SCEC and partners in our organization, like what might be coming down the pike. I think Charles's answer around really strengthening the safety net is spot on. Then that's very much on our minds. Like, how can people turn to existing available supports for essential needs? And we're fundraising, like I'm typing for that kind of work today. But the Connection Initiative was also developed in collaboration with leadership at the Community Caring Collaborative to be a place where community members and people acting on their behalf can turn to find connection to locally available resources and supports. And so a community member who may be experiencing a challenge or a thing that they relied on for a long time isn't available anymore can reach out to the Connection Initiative and ask for help to find a resource or formal support that could meet their need. And as Charles mentioned, a person acting on their behalf, a caregiver, provider, a navigator, they could also reach out on their clients or family's behalf to get connected to resources. That I can drop the contact information for the Connection Initiative in the chat. In the coming years, and this is in response to what I think grassroots response that really is a call to action right now. The Connection Initiative is going to be building capacity, not just to connect people to formal organizational resources and supports, but to other people who just want to help and can help in community as neighbors. So we're doing both and growing that program.
That's nice. That's nice. I do like the non-political part of this, by the way. It's something that I think is desperately needed, which is why I suggested that some sort of way of clearinghouse of facts, as well as would be of tremendous value.
And we definitely will. I mean, as I've said, this is to some degree the deep end of the pool when it comes to figuring out the federal impact in Washington County. These are a bunch of data sets that are not meant to be used together. And we will be improving, I think, how this presentation works over time, hopefully, and would welcome, again, suggestions. And we'll be looking at it again as more data is published, particularly as we actually know what the decisions will be. Which will be a while, I think, till we know what the federal funding levels will be in the different departments and the different programs. But I think we'll have a better sense of impact at that point. any final thoughts or questions before we wrap up? Well, thank you all for coming. We will be sending out a slide deck probably this afternoon. Actually, I'll touch base with you, but I think that's something we can do. Please feel free to reach out. I'll make sure my email's in that email just so that you can reach out if you have a question. I'd be happy to share the data sets I was working with and kind of the manipulations I did to come up with these slides or these adjusted numbers. And would definitely, if you have any questions, I can share kind of the work that came into this point. So thank you all.